Today's seminar is by Dr. Karen McGlathery from the University of Virginia. Dr. McGlathery is a professor of environmental sciences at UVA, director of their Environmental Institute, and lead of both the NSF-funded Virginia Coast Reserve Long-Term Ecological Research Project and the Eastern Shore of Virginia Climate Equity Project. Her research focuses on the effects of environmental change on coastal marine ecosystems, in particular focus on seagrass restoration, blue carbon sequestration in coastal habitats, and the effects of marine heat waves on seagrasses. Her seminar today will describe a climate equity project that is focused on developing capacity and reducing inequities of climate risk for rural communities. Thank you, Karen, for joining us. I'm pleased to turn this over to you for your presentation. As a reminder, the Q&A session will follow the presentation, so please feel free to type your questions in the chat and we will get to them after the presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. We and ODU. I'm really happy today to be talking about a large interdisciplinary project of which we is a part of that focuses on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, shown here, which you all know quite well, I'm sure. And it is focused on working with rural communities to build capacity for climate adaptation. And this project is funded by the Coast and People Program of NSF, COPE, and we're about halfway through the project, so I will be describing for you work that is in progress. So on the Eastern Shore, like many rural communities, populations are impacted by climate in disproportionate ways. On the Eastern Shore, we're focused primarily on sea level rise, affecting groundwater and also coastal flooding and storm surge flooding. On the Eastern Shore, this is, as you well know, a very flat landscape. The Route 13, the Continental Divide, is only about 15 meters above sea level at its highest point. So any small increase in sea level or flooding can impact a large area. Sea level rise rates are about 3 times the global average in this part of Virginia. And also we're seeing lots of sunny day flooding. We just had a king tide earlier this month. And our record of storms goes back about 100 years and about 120 years. And we are seeing increases in storm frequency. Most rural communities like the Eastern Shore are especially vulnerable to climate change, in part because people are just quite isolated, both socially and in terms of the support they get from communities. Governments there's often not a lot of institutional infrastructure and support that coordinates activities across these regions. Some places like Oyster, Virginia, which is right around here, where our research lab is an unincorporated village, so it has no representation other than through the Planning District Commission. So this shows Cape Charles. We were just talking about that in the introduction session. Cape Charles is one of those areas that has grown quite a lot. But generally, you can see what the landscape looks like. And so to the right of your slide is Chesapeake Bay, of course, and to the left are the Barrier Islands and the Atlantic Ocean. So the population is as I mentioned, very low density, about 6 to 10 people per square kilometer. And it's actually expected to decline in the next 15 years. There is a large proportion of the population that is from traditionally underserved groups. And also about 30 to 40% of children as of 2018 live in poverty. So it is an area where there aren't necessarily the resources to support different kinds of climate adaptation strategies. So in working with the communities, these are the kinds of concerns that they told us they had. Decisions that they were making in terms of shoring up shorelines through hardening or living shorelines, infrastructure that is either undersized or outdated or not managed. So there's a lot of problem with drainage on roads, elevation of roads and buildings, septic systems that aren't functioning because of a rising water table due to sea level rise, and also just dealing with land use. You can see here in this picture, this is an area near Brownsville, an agricultural area. You can see right here are the marshes that are migrating inland and also on both sides. So decisions that landowners are making. So to address this challenge of not having adequate information and support to understand climate risks, to make data-informed decisions, we got a team together to address this by co-producing what I've described here, what we've described as a climate equity atlas that is essentially a decision support platform. It's a visualization, data visualization underlain by physical models on groundwater and storm surge to assess where and when and to what extent flooding and salinization of groundwater, for example, are happening. And I'll talk a little bit first about the co-production process, and then I'll talk with the community, and then I'll talk about some of the models that are underlying the atlas and how we're building. I'll show you sort of a prototype of the atlas as it's being built. So this co-production word is used a lot. It's thrown around a lot. I'll just tell you how we're using it. We're using it to talk about the joint creation of this project with different stakeholder groups in the community, including scholars, academics, UVA and ODU, and also community members. Importantly, there's two-way communication throughout the entire project, and I'll touch a little bit on how we're doing that. So that's what we refer to by co-production. The guiding principle we have is that by working together to produce this knowledge that's both place-based, local knowledge, lived experience, and also our academic domain knowledge about water and flooding, that we're much more likely to help create these socio-environmental systems, communities that are adaptive over the long term and not just reactive. I'll make a point here, I'll talk about it in a second, but a key part of this is sharing power with the community members, that they work really right alongside the leaders of the project. So there's just sort of very complex Venn, I don't even know if it's called a Venn diagram with all these circles, but the idea here is to look at, here's where the climate research is that we're doing. Here's where where we integrate non-expert perspectives with the climate research to address issues that are relevant to the community and that can be actionable. And an important part here is that by working through this co-production process, we're not just thinking about things that are relevant and actionable, also things that are equitable, that are prioritized by the community. And so this idea of sort of addressing the power imbalance really helps drive social change in the system. And so our team is big. We have about 20 researchers and support staff. A dozen grad students, postdocs, and a couple undergrads who work in the project on the summer. We are a very interdisciplinary team. A key part of our project, which is shown here by this diagram, is that we have a community advisory committee, and I'll talk about that in a second, that includes a dozen people from a number of different anchor institutions, and they work closely with us through a different mechanisms to get feedback and to get input on how to move this project forward in a way that's valuable. We also have an external evaluator that looks from the outside and tells us how we're doing and what we could be doing better. So the social infrastructure, as I mentioned, is really designed with incorporating or integrating both academic and lived knowledge. A key part of it are these two community leaders. So Andre Elliott and Karen Downing are our community leaders. They sit on the project, the leadership team with 4 lead PIs, and they're involved in every aspect of what we're doing. And so we're constantly grounding our work in their experience and their input. and the input that we are getting and they are getting from our community advisory committee. Interestingly, Andre and Karen are, they're not in science, they're not PDC members, they're just change agents and influencers in the community. Karen is a pastor at a local Baptist church and also works for Virginia Organizing. And Andre Elliott is director of the YMCA. So they help bring our work, our interests to the community and help broker the input from the community. And they also help build those trusted relationships and bring voices to the table that might not otherwise be there. And so the Community Advisory Committee, you can see the lists down here, involve a number of groups that represent those voices that aren't always heard. So Health Department, United Way, we have Public Schools Planning Commission, Agency on Aging. We also, of course, have the Chamber of Commerce and the Planning District. So it's a very engaged and diverse group of community advisors who meet quarterly with the project leadership and then help us organize larger community events. And here's just sort of different ways that we're engaging with the community, and afterwards in the Q&A, I'd be happy to discuss any of these in more detail. But we do a lot of interviews and focus groups. We have annual or semi-annual big community events across the peninsula to bring, to share some of what we're doing, get feedback. It's a very iterative process. And this is one thing I particularly like. This is a timeline that we created in our very first workshop that we revisit every time. It's about 12 feet long, 15 feet long, and essentially asks people to put on that timeline different events, or mostly events. And it could be something like building the Bay Bridge Tunnel, or it could be the boat that used to go from Cape Charles across the Chesapeake Bay. It could be a particular hurricane. Things that they remember, or things that stories, narratives that they've gotten from their community, from their family members, or from others. And so it helps us ground that work that we're doing in the stories and the identity of place that is very strong on the Eastern Shore. And this is just one of the first iterations of it in one of our first workshops. Okay, so in terms of how we're building this climate equity atlas, I'm first, I'll just describe to you the general framing, and then I'll go through some of the underlying models and data that we're using to create the atlas. So essentially what we're doing is we are integrating social data, so demographic data, population data, with environmental data derived from models, groundwater models and storm surge models that are spatially explicit across the landscape. And then we're linking that to an analysis of social networks, how information is flowing throughout the community, who are key nodes of information, who is on the edges or maybe not getting enough information, to help us understand how people are making decisions relative to climate risk. And so what these different layers, its integration will eventually produce is a climate equity atlas, which essentially is a data visualization that's interactive, where we can look at different climate scenarios and how those might play out across the landscape. And then that is connected also to some measures of burden, of social equity or social risk. And the goal is to be able to use this atlas that we're building in this iterative way with the community to then do these what-if scenarios with the community in terms of different ways that they might adapt. Putting a shoreline in, raising a road, raising a septic system above ground, various things that the community has said is important. So it becomes this way of sort of being able to look at what might happen in the future. And before I move on, to talk about the atlas, I just wanted to highlight a couple things. One is we entered this project when it was funded by NSF, thinking about storm flooding, saltwater intrusion, and and what the impacts were of different land uses on water removal and groundwater recharge. What we heard from the community was we really care mostly about the rising sea level causing failing septic systems and where that's going to occur and how to deal with that. We're really interested in storm surge flooding and how that's affecting mobility, and that combined with inland flooding can cause road washouts. So in red are the ways that we've modified the project from where we started at the beginning based on what was most important for the community, with the ultimate goal that by the end of this 5-year project, we'll have something that is relevant and usable by the community. And this is Karen in the middle, one of our project leaders, Andre, is here. During these workshops, the community workshops, they're the ones presenting the project. The scientists, we're all in the background. And so it's really, they're owning this project, and it's a really important way that they're bringing in really important and relevant partnerships for the project. And here's we. So I'm going to walk through some of the different parts of the Equity Atlas. And I'm going to start first with work that we're doing on groundwater. So the key issues, the twin impacts of climate change on this part of the coast is, as I mentioned, saltwater intrusion into groundwater from both removal of fresh water, pulling saltwater in, but also increasing sea level. And this sole source aquifer of the Eastern Shore is where all the water is coming from for drinking, for irrigation, for supporting any kind of industry. A key thing, as I mentioned, with the sea level rise is the impact it's having on failing septic systems. And what's I found really interesting that I've worked there for 25 years that I hadn't really thought about was that you can have just really small scale, like parcel to parcel differences in the vulnerability to sea level rise and failing septic systems, like just maybe half a meter or a meter difference in elevation can mean that your neighbor might have a septic system that perks, but you don't. And so the challenge of modeling at both this large peninsular scale and also this smaller local scale is I'll show you a little bit how we're addressing that. So we're also looking at how land use and land cover impacts both water demand and recharge. I'm not going to talk today about solar, but it turns out that there's a lot of, like a lot of places, there's a lot of I don't know what the right word is, pressure, or there's solar fields that are being developed on the Eastern Shore. They're quite controversial because in most cases they're taking land out of that's arable. And so we're doing some work on how solar fields are affecting the groundwater in terms of salinity and recharge, but it is not something that is a big priority for the community. It's something they're quite concerned about on the whole. So we're using this model, for those of you who are groundwater hydrologists, if there's anyone here who is, it's CWAT model. It's basically simulating groundwater volume and soil, water, and runoff, incorporating different land use and management strategies. So it includes soil, water, and runoff, as I mentioned, recharge and groundwater, and also stream flow. And what this map shows, sort of a heat map that shows the head. So it shows the hydraulic head of the groundwater. And you can see areas where I've put these red arrows. These sort of red bullseyes are where there are large extraction wells to primarily support agriculture. Interestingly, this one at Exmoor, there's some thought that might also reflect sort of the geology of the area, that this is an old paleo channel and the edge of the Chesapeake Bay impact crater. So creating these heat maps is sort of the first step in understanding groundwater levels. And that becomes important, and I'll mention in a second, in terms of understanding where septic systems might succeed or fail. And so the model also, and this is the model that's being used by the state uses it to evaluate groundwater use and water table drawdown based on all different kinds of usage, whether it's agriculture, commercial, municipal, industrial. Most of the industry is in large scale ag, also poultry, and as I mentioned, solar. What we are adding to this model is future scenarios of sea level rise. So the state model just includes current conditions. So we're looking at sea level rise rates over 20-year increments, 2040, 2060, 2080, and 2100, under different conditions of water removal. And this shows we are able to get from that an estimate of salt, or map essentially, of saltwater intrusion into this groundwater aquifer. And so this, of course, is important for drinking water. This is where the drinking water comes from. This is where the water comes, all the fresh water comes from for any kind of land use or industry. Right, I've made a note here that this light green here, these areas, anything light green or warm in the warm tones, is over 250 milligrams per liter, which is when humans begin to taste saltiness. So any of that, those warmer tones are where salinization would be apparent in the current conditions. So, you know, next year I can show you maps of the different future scenarios. So one of the big reasons, other than water supply, that groundwater is important is that you need a minimum, now it's going to be in feet, but you're going to need a minimum of 2.5 feet between the surface of the land and the groundwater table in order to support a septic system that will perk, that will function. And so there are many regions on the Eastern Shore where septic systems are failing. And you can see all of the red are areas that may not support septic systems. And these are Barrier Islands. I wouldn't pay any attention to those because those people aren't out there, but look here on the main part of the peninsula. And of course, these areas are marshy. So anything sort of on the green and then here. So these are all areas, red is they may not support septic systems, and orange are areas that are in risk. So we're seeing whole communities like the community of Oyster, where the UVA lab is, where septic systems aren't perking. They're thinking about building a community septic system. Of course, the level of the groundwater is going to be affected a lot by climate in terms of rainfall and sea level rise and temperature. And so we build also this risk into our future scenarios. So the other thing that I'm going to talk about is the storm surge modeling. The groundwater modeling I just mentioned is being led by Larry Band and Teresa Culver at UVA. The storm surge modeling is being led by Patricia Weiberg. And so this, here's just sort of 2 images from our community engagement workshops, where one was where we showed a representation of inundation by Hurricane Ida in 2009, and asked them to put sticky notes on places that gave us information about how they experienced that flooding, where they might have seen it be worse, just their own personal experience from that. We also asked them, more generally about different concerns they had about storms and flooding. Things like, here's Chincoteague, economic impacts, along with human impacts or ecological impacts, changes in currents and how that affects storms, subsidence being a factor about affecting storm surge. So these are all the kinds of things that we're hearing from the community. And this is an example from Saxis during, I'm not sure which hurricane this was. I think it might have been Isabel. So what I'm going to be talking about is how we have used historic hurricanes in order to model storm surge, and then using those historic hurricanes to think about what future conditions might be with rising sea levels. So we can, once we create our model with data from historic hurricanes, we can then train it to think about future storms. And so we looked at a 40-year record of storms. So this is the total cumulative inundation intensity from 1979 to about 2021. Interestingly, we had about 4 to 5 events per year. There is, in that 40-year period, there is no trend of increasing storminess. So it's basically just a flat line. If we look at the effects of sea level rise on top of the storm, so this would say, okay, at a particular point in the land, on the land, what is the storm surge? So that incorporates sea level rise. You can see this long-term trend of increasing storm surge flooding. We found from the largest 5%, or the 5% of the biggest storms, that they added about a meter on top of the high tide level. So we're using this model, AdCirc, many of you probably know about that, a storm surge model, to characterize a range of storm events across that would affect both sides of the peninsula. So both the Chesapeake Bay side and the seaside. And that's the input to the model I've listed here is bathymetry, wind and pressure fields during these specific events, and tidal forcing. And what it gives us is an output of both the temporal and the spatial variations of storm surge water levels, and also what the maximum water level is. And this is just an example here of one of the model runs. The idea behind this is that one can't just model one storm and then put it in an atlas like that and then say this is what a storm impact is going to be. And that it's really important that we model a range of storms, and then we can model big storms, small storms, medium storms. What is it going to look like with this level of sea level rise or that level of sea level rise, so that we're giving people a range of conditions that they might experience with storms now in the future. So these are the 5 storms that were modeled: Floyd, 1999, Isabel, 2003, Sandy in 2012, Joaquin in 2015, and Dorian in 2019. And you can see that they were picked specifically to represent a range of paths and also to represent a range of intensities. And here's where we are on the Eastern Shore. And so this just shows, this is just one of the model runs. This is for Hurricane Isabel. And this just shows a model run from the storm surge. You can see, of course, the intensity of the storm is greater on the seaside and the Chesapeake Bay side for this particular hurricane. Many of you were probably in Hampton Roads during Isabel in 2003. And these are just some pictures from the time. So what we can then do is say, okay, well, let's take Hurricane Isabel. What if that same storm happened 40 years from now? What would be the difference between what you experienced in 2003 and what you would experience in 2043? And it is, again, sort of spatially representative, so you can see where, if you were a different place on the peninsula, what might you experience? And this model run shows it for the seaside here. And what we found was that because sea level rise is sort of increases the flooding uniformly, the biggest driver of the spatial patterns of flooding is going to be wind speeds and wind direction. And what we found for 2043 is that the conditions, that hurricane would give about 2/3 of a meter, 0.66 meters higher in terms of storm surge than what was experienced in 2003. So this is a way, and we can pick different storms to model this way, depending on what the community says. Community wants us to recreate what happened in the storm of 1933, which was the big storm that really wreaked havoc on the shore. That's hard for us to do because we don't have the data to parameterize that particular storm. But one could take a storm of equal intensity or similar intensity and try to model that. So we can really model a range of conditions for people to evaluate. So these two examples I've given, I've talked about what's going on the peninsula scale, but we're also hearing from people, they really want to know what's happening on the local scale. As I mentioned, like you can have differences parcel to parcel, depending on what your elevation is. And this is a picture of Willis Wharf. Many of you have probably already been there. It's a working waterfront on the seaside. Here's the looking out to the Barrier Islands and to the Atlantic Ocean. For me, this is one of the kind of aha moments of this project. I mentioned we were preparing for a site review from the National Science Foundation, and we were driving along this road down. You go, down like a half a meter in elevation down along the road. All of these roads, as you can imagine, can be flooded during a high tide or storm surge. What was so interesting to me was as we were leaving, like the difference between a house right here and a house right here, just that difference in elevation. This house has a septic system that doesn't perk. This house and this house has a septic system that does. So really, when we're thinking about decisions at an individual level or even at a community level, we need to be able to model a much finer scale than the models that I showed you previously. And so we're doing that for some of these communities. We started with Willis Wharf, the one I just showed you. And in this case, what we're doing is we're combining the storm surge model I just showed you with the hydrologic model. So this is it's a regional hydrologic model. Essentially what it's doing is looking at sort of downslope water flow and also water flow into the subsurface and how that's impacted by infrastructure, whether you're talking about drainage or water use or storm sewers. The value of this is it's a very small scale. It's like on the scale of meters, whereas the storm surge model is on the scale of tens of meters. And here's just an example of what we can get from combining the storm surge model with this local hydrologic model, is that we can basically what it does is it takes the storm and it propagates it up through a tidal creek and then out onto the coastal plain. And so you can then zoom in and see what areas are flooded by storm surge. And also with the hydrologic model, you could begin to calculate how much salt water is getting into the local groundwater. So it's a way that we can begin to assess these sort of local scale processes. And we're doing this for a number of communities on the shore. Okay, so I want to take just like the last 10 minutes to talk a little bit about how we're integrating some of these environmental data models into the atlas. And then I'll mention at the end how we're beginning to use that to assess how we plan to use that to look at information flow and decision making. So this is going to be a short video that was created by Michelle Claiborne, who is the main architect of the atlas. And she's going to describe to you just an example of some of the peninsula scale work I just discussed. And also she'll show you the Willis Wharf. And this sort of we'll talk a little bit about how one navigates this atlas. And this is something that we bring to the community, and then we get their feedback and we modify it, and then we bring it back again. So it's a iterative process.
The current version of the Climate Equity Atlas is the first iteration where we start exploring ways of presenting the outcomes generated by the science and engineering teams. Here, we have storm surge simulations based on multiple events, Hurricane Isabel and king tides, with contemporary estimates and projected outcomes for 2050. While the underlying models generate data at higher spatial resolution, here we're aggregating those outcomes to the census block group level, summarized in multiple ways. The maximum surge height in the area, the peak surge, the average surge height across the area, the mean surge, and the percent of the area inundated by a storm surge. For a selected scenario, each available measure is provided by the block group, identified by community-created names in the heat grid for easy comparison. And the selected measure is displayed on the map. For more localized focal sites, we're exploring ways of sharing outcomes at a higher resolution. Here again, we have storm surge simulations for Hurricane Isabel, both in 2003 and projected for 2050 for Willis Ward, with multiple outcomes available. And we can zoom in to see more detail of the area and the measures. To see the intersection of community impacts and community populations, the aggregated climate measures are graphed alongside community population characteristics. This makes existing patterns more evident and highlights communities with both relatively high climate impacts and greater concentrations of resident characteristics that historically limit resiliency. Here we see that Marionville and Kendall Grove had the highest average storm surge height across the community during Hurricane Isabel, and one of the highest concentrations of residents who identify as Black. We provide additional population characteristics that could be selected for comparison as well. And for a selected community, the fuller set of community characteristics are summarized to provide a fuller population context.
So this shows just the same graph that Michelle showed before. And the point I just want to make here is that one of the things that we want to hear from the community is what are those characteristics of populations that are most meaningful in terms of presenting the data for climate risks to different groups on the Eastern Shore. So one of the challenges, opportunities and challenges is the question of what is the right level of aggregation that is most useful for decision-making, but also does not compromise privacy. So Michelle showed you like the first iteration is census block groups. Okay, that says blue, census block groups. And that shows you, very sort of coarse scale kind of patterns, but it's not very useful for individuals or even some communities for making decisions. So challenging is, it's challenging to show the data at a parcel level because one wouldn't want their private property information to be publicly available. That might affect property values. It might affect people's privacy if their septic system isn't working. So we've been going back and forth thinking a lot about that. How do we make the tool most useful for the most number of people? And one of the things that we're landing on is to look at census blocks. So on the, high hundreds of parts of blocks or even low thousands in terms of the numbers of data points that we can show that are more fine-grained than the census block groups and also preserve privacy that you wouldn't otherwise get with showing parcels. So this, again, is sort of a work in progress and important to get feedback from the community. So the last part I want to talk about is how we take all these pieces that we are developing. So the environmental risks and impacts, the socioeconomic data, to come up with what is the risk and burden that different communities are facing. And how do we use the Equity Atlas to help people make data-informed decisions that are hopefully long-lasting? So there's two ways that we're going about doing this. One is through establishing what the stakeholder network is. So how are people connected here in these communities? How is information flowing? What are the key interactions? Who are making decisions? And how is could this be relevant for policymaking? And the other aspect is to do agent-based models to simulate decisions of different kind of intervention and adaptation scenarios. And Majid Shafi-Jude and we, Yosef, are leading this part of the project. So the first thing we did is construct a stakeholder network. This was done initially through interviews and also analyzing the content, the words that were included, and the different organizations that people said that they were working with, and agencies in coastal planning and resilience. So we get this sort of prototype map. Then we bring that to the workshop and we work through it and modify it with community members. We did this over a several hour period. People were asked the question, how does information flow, between key actors, and who are the knowledge brokers in the area? And you can see again, these sticky notes, DEQ, William and Mary, VMRC, TNC, different organizations, and people put them in there and used thread to figure out who was connected. And so what we get after the workshop is something that looks like this. So we have a model now of how information is flowing throughout these 2 counties on the Eastern Shore. And this will help us understand how decisions are being made. And so this is just the last slide I have. This is work that is just beginning. It was dependent on having the environmental data and models and some of the socioeconomic data put into the atlas. And now Majid and others are using this to begin to do participatory experiments to understand, to work with people to understand how they use this information to make decisions. And then what are the outcomes of those decisions? And here are just some of the things I mentioned earlier that have come up from some of the interviews. So just a few summary comments. I think I've shown you where we are with doing the groundwater modeling, looking at salinization and water table height, both of which are important for water security, but also septic systems. And on some local scales, in some communities, we're integrating this with the storm surge modeling. For the storm surge, using past storms to help parameterize our models, and then using those to look at future storm surge. We also heard from the community that they really want to know about king tides, what the impacts of those are going to be, or other kind of quote nuisance flooding. And so we've increased our focus. We didn't have a focus on that in the initial proposal, so we added that to our project. And we're also integrating the storm surge modeling, both with the inland flooding modeling that I just mentioned, but also with models of road access. So people are quite concerned about road closures, road washouts, access to schools, access to emergency care. And so being able to map that for the community in real time is something that we are working on. And that this mapping tool and visualization tool is something that we are working side by side with the community to develop, so that we can hand it to them and it's usable to them. And just a couple comments on the co-production aspect of what we're doing. I think one thing I've learned is not only the reciprocal engagement, working back and forth, iterating, not just handing and getting feedback, but just being super open, being nimble, listening, also sharing power. Having community members be on the leadership committee is really, really important. And then it takes time to develop these strong networks and partnerships. We have a lot of people on the project who are working really hard on this aspect of it, to be true to what we say we'll do, and making it as salient as possible for the community members. And the goal, of course, is to be able to promote these informed decisions that will have long-term strategies for adaptation, not sort of reactive short-term strategies. And then I just put a point on this issue of data ethics. It's super important to think about how you're going to, in anything like this, how you're going to convey the data, and how you're going to manage it so that you are respectful of the people who those data represent. And a big part of having this project be sustainable is data literacy, is working with community members to own and work with the atlas. So I'm going to end there. I want to just acknowledge the funding from the Coast and people and get ready because I'm going to put a lot of people up. But these are the people that are part of the project. It's a really big project. A lot of really talented people working on this in the scientific community engagement. Our community members have just been so committed to the project, and our graduate students, and our evaluator. So now I will end.
All right. Thank you so much, Karen, for that presentation. We already have one question in the chat from Robin, who asks, what was your best strategy to get citizens to participate? And was it easier to get decision makers at the table versus citizens?
So the key process was first having our community leaders develop this community advisory committee. And then it was through the community advisory committee that people were invited to participate in these community workshops. So the invitations were always from community members, not from project leadership. So, as I showed in that picture, we really want it to be their project, and we really rely on them to bring people in. And so I would say our community leaders in the community advisory committee was really important. I mean, we did lots of other ways of connecting with people, but I think that was probably the most effective. In terms of sort of the second part of your question, yeah, I think it is easier to get decision makers, whomever they are. I mean, it might be someone who's with United Way, it isn't necessarily a PDC person, but the people that we ended up having on our community advisory committee, they're really committed to the projects. With citizens, I think tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure we had like 60% return rate from one workshop to the next one. So that felt good. It felt like people continued to be interested. And we actually also purposely have workshops in different parts of the peninsula because it's maybe hard for people to drive an hour to get to one. So Vicky, yep.
So we have another question, and kind of a kudos for garnering community participation. What methods or platforms are you using to report information or data gathered back to the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are several ways that we're doing it. One is, we have like a newsletter. That's an easy thing. We communicate that to a lot of people. The other thing is we have these repeated workshops. And so every workshop that we have builds on the previous workshop. So, workshop 2, we say, okay, we learned this from you in workshop 1, and here's what we have now. What do you think? And then we get their feedback. And then workshop 3, we do the same thing. So we are all along the way conveying back to them what we've done with the feedback we've gotten from them. That's the second way. And then the third is we're now in a position where we have the prototype of the atlas that you saw, and we can start. Actually, we did in August in our workshop, we had it there on laptops and got feedback. And so again, that's another way that we would do it. So I guess those would be the 3 main ways that I would describe how we are reporting back and continuing to engage with the community.
And then there's a question about when projecting past storms into the future, do you include other potential flooding impacts like slower storms or increased rainfall?
Yes, that is something that's included in the storm modeling.
I think those are the questions that have been put into the chat. Anyone in the audience, questions? I see Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, great talk. Yeah, I like the bubbling up of the community problems. I wonder if water quality in aquaculture jumped in that, or were they just lower? Like, think about future climate model, downscaling, and water quality issues.
Yeah, it absolutely bubbled up. And we don't have the capacity in our current grant to address it in a really responsible way, you know, in a appropriate way. But we are planning on then adding it moving forward. I think it's a really big issue. Water quality is a huge issue, especially with all the industrial ag. But beyond salt water, all the nutrient toxics, all that, we didn't have the capacity in this grant to address it. That's a challenge, you know, that's sort of the challenging part, is sort of, you know, you have a project that's funded with certain deliverables, and in NSF says, you know, ideally in year 1, you shouldn't know what year 5 is going to be, but there's some limits to how far you can pivot because you've committed resources to do certain things. And that's just one of those really important problems in terms of basic water quality and and poultry in particular. Our community advisors were a little nervous about it, to be honest, Tom, like that, because, you know, the challenges is like they're huge employers, and we start taking them. So I think it's really, it's a big, complicated issue. And I think we just didn't, while we're aware of it and we can provide resources for them, we just couldn't take that on as part of this project, but it could be down the road. That's
interesting. And I think the tactical scale of things with septic systems and individual property owners, that's really, you know, a tricky one. Might be interested in sharing. We've been doing a NSF project with Anna Maria Bukvik at Tech with 2 watersheds on the shore, and I'm doing some, it's called dasometric mapping. So it's basically like taking census data, but instead of using only the polygons, doing an interpolation technique to put sort of people in pixels or hexagons or what have you. It does at least get around some of the super, I guess, fine scale personal aspects of that.
Yeah, a lot of what we're seeing is this interest in community septic systems. So there's some really small villages, like the one in Oyster where our lab is, and there's another one on the Bay side, and we've talked with a person there. It's like a really small scale community organizer, and so that's one way to address it. It's like, okay, we're all in, you know, and this whole community is sitting right here where salt water is coming in from sea level rise, and so let's band together, and that seems to be an effective approach.
Okay, and I think Hampton Roads Sanitation District has moved over to the Eastern Shore. I might be wrong about that, but interconnecting everything.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kind of building off of that last question / comment, there's a question in the chat that asks about what options are there for those that have septic systems that aren't working.
Right. Raising your septic system above ground or building a community septic system, which has it's less about perking and more about processing the sewage. So those are the 2 main options that people are dealing with. Some people, like our site director, is thinking about moving because she bought a house 5 years ago in Wills Wharf, the picture I showed you, that community, and her septic system isn't working now. So she may end up just moving. So that's another option. Not that many people want to do that.
That might not be an option for a lot of other residents, kind of given, you know, what the housing market looks like currently as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's generally not the option people want to follow.
I know you've elaborated a little bit, but there's a follow-up question about what would the community septic system look like?
Yeah, well, I'm not an engineer, so I'll do the best I can, Lillian, but it is, and I know Dewberry, you probably know Dewberry, the consulting company that does a lot of work for the state. They were involved with this community of Oyster. But my understanding, it is like a little mini processing plant that you have, it's piped in from the different households. So it has to be a fairly, like a village as opposed to a really widely distributed area. And then the water is processed and then released. So it's like a little sewage treatment plant. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.